Some valleys are remembered not for the battles fought on their soil, but for the silence they buried beneath it. This is the story of a forgotten path, where the earth swallowed more than footsteps, and the air carried secrets long denied. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and the time, because it's always powerful to see how far these stories travel. In 1989, Marcus Chen, son of renowned Hong Kong filmmaker David Chun, vanished into the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a grieving family. Unlike the wild theories you may have read online, this is the carefully researched truth his loved ones have waited decades to hear. What really happened during his final mission? Why did it take 35 years to discover his equipment? And what incredible footage was still preserved inside his camera? But here's what nobody expected: the discovery that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about his disappearance. Before we explore Marcus's story, I want you to know this investigation prioritizes facts over speculation. Your engagement helps ensure stories like this get the thorough coverage they deserve. Marcus Chen wasn't just another missing war correspondent. He was cinema royalty, son of the legendary David Chun, who had directed some of Hong Kong's most celebrated films. But Marcus chose a different path from movie studios and film festivals. He picked up a news camera instead of a director's megaphone in the late 1980s. While the world watched the Soviet-Afghan war unfold on television, Marcus was there documenting the real story. He worked for CNN International, bringing viewers raw footage of what conflict actually looked like. His reports were powerful and unflinching. They showed both the devastation and the resilience of people caught in war. Marcus had inherited his father's artistic eye, but he used it to capture truth instead of fiction. He wasn't chasing fame or fortune in those dangerous mountains. He was chasing stories that needed to be told. But on September 15th, 1989, that pursuit of truth led him deep into the Afghan highlands, where a mystery would begin that would torment his family for over 3 decades. And what he captured on film during those final days would eventually expose secrets that powerful people had tried to bury forever. To understand what happened to Marcus Chen, we need to understand who he was. Born in 1955, Marcus grew up in the glamorous world of Hong Kong cinema. His father David was famous for directing epic martial arts films and historical dramas that played in theaters worldwide. Movies like Dragon's Gate and The Last Emperor's Guard had made David Chen one of Asia's most respected filmmakers. But Marcus's childhood wasn't all red carpets and movie premieres. His parents divorced when he was 12, a scandal that rocked Hong Kong's entertainment industry. Marcus lived primarily with his mother, actress Lin Wei, in their apartment overlooking Victoria Harbor. Lin Wei had been a major star in the 1960s, appearing in dozens of films before retiring to raise Marcus. The divorce was bitter and public, with both parents using the media to air their grievances. Marcus was caught in the middle of this very public family drama. He was introspective and serious, very different from his charismatic father and dramatic mother. The constant attention from Hong Kong's tabloid press made him uncomfortable and shy. As a teenager, he briefly tried acting, appearing in small roles in 2 of his father's films, but the spotlight never suited him. He was more drawn to real stories than scripted ones. Young Marcus found refuge in books and documentaries about world events. He was particularly fascinated by news coverage of conflicts around the globe. While his classmates dreamed of becoming movie stars, Marcus was drawn to the work of war correspondents and photojournalists who risked their lives to bring important stories to the world. In his early 20s, Marcus discovered broadcast journalism while studying at the University of Hong Kong. He realized he could tell compelling stories with his camera and reporting skills, just like his father, but without the artifice of cinema. War correspondence became his calling. It was dangerous work, but Marcus believed it served an important purpose. He wanted to show audiences the human cost of conflict, to make distant wars real and immediate for people watching safely at home. This commitment to truth would eventually take him to Afghanistan, where his dedication to documenting reality would put him in more danger than any movie set ever could. But first, he would need to prove himself as a serious journalist. Starting with smaller assignments closer to home, Marcus began his journalism career in 1978, working for local Hong Kong television stations covering regional news. His father was initially disappointed that Marcus had rejected the film industry, but Lin Wei supported her son's choice. She had seen how the entertainment business could destroy families, and she respected Marcus's desire to do something meaningful with his life. Marcus's early work focused on political developments in Southeast Asia. He covered the Vietnamese boat people crisis, the Cambodian refugee situation, and political unrest in the Philippines. His reports were notable for their compassion and attention to human detail. While other correspondents focused on politics and military strategy, Marcus always found ways to show how major events affected ordinary people. His breakthrough came in 1983 when he covered the American invasion of Grenada for a regional news network. Marcus was one of the few Asian journalists on the island, and his reports provided a fresh perspective on the conflict. His footage of civilians caught in the fighting was powerful and moving. International news organizations began to notice his work. By 1985, Marcus had joined CNN International as a freelance correspondent based in Hong Kong. His first major assignment was covering the ongoing conflict in Sri Lanka between government forces and Tamil separatists. The work was dangerous, but Marcus thrived in the environment. He had found his calling as a war correspondent, that his colleagues at CNN were impressed by Marcus's professionalism and courage. He had an unusual ability to gain the trust of people on all sides of conflicts. Soldiers, civilians, and rebel fighters alike seemed comfortable talking to him. This skill made him invaluable for getting inside access to stories that other journalists couldn't reach. Marcus also had excellent technical skills with broadcast equipment. He could operate cameras, edit footage, and handle satellite communications equipment that allowed him to send reports from remote locations. This combination of journalistic instincts and technical expertise made him one of CNN's most versatile correspondents in the Asia-Pacific region. By early 1989, Marcus Chen had already established himself as a respected war correspondent with a reputation for taking calculated risks to get important stories. He had covered conflicts in Lebanon, Nicaragua, and the Philippines for CNN International. His footage was valued by editors and fellow journalists alike for its authenticity and emotional impact. Marcus had earned a reputation for getting remarkably close to combat zones, sometimes worrying his colleagues with his fearless approach to dangerous assignments. Other correspondents would later describe Marcus as someone who seemed to have no fear, but who was actually very methodical about assessing risks. He studied military tactics, learned local languages, and always worked with experienced fixers who knew the terrain. His approach to war reporting was influenced by the legendary photojournalists he admired, like Robert Capa and Tim Page. Marcus believed that authentic storytelling required being where the action was happening. You couldn't capture the reality of war from a safe distance. This philosophy would serve him well in numerous assignments, but it would also eventually lead him into mortal danger. In August 1989, CNN assigned Marcus to cover the final stages of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The 9-year conflict was ending, and the network wanted comprehensive coverage of this historic moment. The Soviet Union had announced that all its forces would be out of Afghanistan by February 1990, but the situation remained chaotic and dangerous. Marcus accepted the assignment immediately, despite warnings from colleagues who considered Afghanistan the most dangerous assignment in international journalism. He understood that Afghanistan would be even more perilous than his previous assignments. The country was in chaos, with various Mujahideen factions fighting Soviet forces and each other. But Marcus felt this story demanded to be told properly. The end of the Soviet-Afghan War was one of the most significant geopolitical events of the 1980s, marking the beginning of the Soviet Union's final collapse. Marcus wanted to document not just the military aspects of the withdrawal, but its human impact on the Afghan people who had endured nearly a decade of devastating warfare. He packed his broadcast equipment and flew to Pakistan, planning to cross into Afghanistan from there. Marcus had spent weeks preparing for the assignment, studying maps, reading intelligence reports, and interviewing other journalists who had worked in Afghanistan. He felt as ready as anyone could be for such a dangerous mission. Marcus had no way of knowing this assignment would become his final one, or that the footage he would capture would remain buried in the Afghan mountains for 35 years before, revealing the truth about his disappearance. Afghanistan in 1989 was a nation devastated by nearly a decade of brutal warfare that had killed over 1 million people and displaced millions more. The Soviet Union was completing its military withdrawal after years of fighting against Mujahideen resistance fighters backed by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. The conflict had become a proxy war in the broader Cold War between superpowers. Different Afghan factions were positioning themselves for control once the Soviets left completely. The Mujahideen were far from united. Various groups with different ethnic, religious, and political orientations were already fighting each other, even as they battled the Soviet forces. The central government in Kabul, led by Mohammad Najibullah, controlled only major cities and key transportation routes. Civilians were caught between these competing forces, facing constant danger from combat, landmines, and economic collapse. The country's infrastructure had been systematically destroyed. Schools, hospitals, bridges, and irrigation systems had been targeted by all sides. Millions of Afghans had fled to refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran, creating one of the world's largest refugee crises. Marcus Chen arrived in Peshawar, Pakistan in late August 1989. This border city had become the base for international journalists covering the Afghan conflict, as well as the headquarters for many Mujahideen groups fighting the Soviet occupation. The city was full of refugees, aid workers, intelligence agents, arms dealers, and journalists from around the world. From Peshawar, reporters would arrange dangerous trips across the border to document the ongoing war. The Pakistani government officially denied allowing such crossings, but in practice, they facilitated Western journalists access to Afghanistan as part of the broader effort to support the Mujahideen against Soviet forces. Marcus worked alongside other correspondents and cameramen, forming the tight-knit community that war journalists create for mutual support and safety. The Foreign Press Corps in Peshawar was small but experienced. Most had covered multiple conflicts and understood the unique dangers of working in Afghanistan. The work routine was exhausting and terrifying. Journalists would spend days or weeks inside Afghanistan, filming battles and interviewing fighters and civilians, then return to Peshawar to edit their footage and transmit reports via satellite. Every assignment brought new risks: sniper fire, artillery bombardments, kidnapping by various armed groups, and the ever-present threat of stepping on landmines left by retreating forces. But Marcus continued his reporting, convinced that the world needed to understand what was happening in Afghanistan. His footage from this period captured the complexity of the conflict and its impact on ordinary Afghans. He interviewed farmers whose fields had been mined, children who had lost limbs to unexploded bombs, and families who had been separated by the war for years. Marcus's reports also documented the various Mujahideen factions and their different approaches to warfare and politics. He filmed meetings between commanders, training camps for fighters, and the sophisticated weapon systems being supplied by foreign sponsors. His work provided viewers with insight into the complexity of Afghanistan's resistance movement that went far beyond simple Cold War narratives. But on September 15th, everything changed when Marcus decided to pursue one particularly dangerous story that would lead him deep into the heart of the conflict. September 15th, 1989, began like many other days for Marcus Chen in Peshawar. He woke up in his room at the Greens Hotel, the unofficial headquarters for foreign journalists covering Afghanistan. He reviewed his equipment, checked his cameras and recording devices, and planned his filming schedule. But this wouldn't be an ordinary assignment. Marcus had received information about a significant battle taking place in the Panjshir Valley, north of Kabul. This valley was one of the most strategically important locations in Afghanistan, controlling access to the northern provinces and serving as a key supply route. Soviet forces were conducting final operations there before their complete withdrawal, while Mujahideen fighters led by Ahmad Shah Massoud were trying to secure control of the territory. Ahmad Shah Massoud, known as the Lion of Panjshir, was one of the most famous and effective Mujahideen commanders. He had successfully resisted multiple Soviet offensives in his valley stronghold over the years, earning international recognition as a brilliant military tactician. Marcus knew that documenting Massoud's forces during these final battles would be an incredibly important story. The assignment was also personally significant for Marcus. His father David had once considered making a film about Afghanistan, and Marcus felt that covering this historic moment would be a way to honor his family's tradition of storytelling while doing it through journalism, rather than cinema. Marcus wouldn't be traveling alone on this dangerous mission. James Morrison, a freelance photographer working for Newsweek magazine, had agreed to join him. James was an experienced war photographer who had covered conflicts in Central America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. At 34, he was slightly older than Marcus and had earned respect among his colleagues for his courage and professionalism. The two men had worked together on several previous assignments and had developed a partnership based on mutual trust and professional respect. They complemented each other well. Marcus focused on video reporting, while James captured still photographs that would help tell the complete story of what they witnessed. That morning, they met at the hotel restaurant to finalize their plans over tea and flatbread. Both men understood the enormous risks involved in traveling to an active combat zone in one of the most dangerous parts of Afghanistan. They reviewed their emergency procedures, confirmed their communication schedules with their editors, and made sure their equipment was in perfect working order. They arranged transportation with Ahmad Shah, a local guide and translator who claimed to know safe routes into the Panjshir Valley. Ahmad was a former Mujahideen fighter who had been wounded in an earlier battle and now made his living helping foreign journalists navigate Afghanistan's complex and dangerous terrain. Travel in Afghanistan required such local knowledge. Roads that were safe one day could become deadly the next as different forces moved through the area. Ahmad claimed to have contacts among Massoud's fighters who could provide safe passage to the battle zone. Neither Marcus nor James had any reason to doubt their guide's credentials or intentions. As they loaded their equipment into a battered Toyota pickup truck, both journalists were optimistic about the assignment ahead. They expected to be back in Peshawar within a week with exclusive footage and photographs of one of the final major battles of the Soviet-Afghan War. Neither Marcus Chen nor James Morrison realized they were heading toward a mystery that would remain unsolved for 35 years, and that the footage Marcus would capture would eventually expose secrets that went far beyond the immediate military conflict they were planning to document. The journey from Peshawar to the Panjshir Valley in 1989 was extremely hazardous, requiring careful navigation through territory controlled by different and often hostile groups. The route passed through areas where various Mujahideen factions operated, some friendly to Western journalists, others deeply suspicious of any foreigners. There were also regions where Soviet forces still conducted operations, launching final attacks before their scheduled withdrawal. Marcus Chen and James Morrison understood these dangers when they set out that morning with their guide Ahmed Shah. The first part of their journey took them through relatively safe areas near the Pakistani border, where Mujahideen groups had established secure supply routes. But as they traveled deeper into Afghanistan, the risks multiplied exponentially. Ahmed proved to be an experienced and cautious guide. He knew which roads to avoid based on recent intelligence about military movements. He also understood the complex tribal politics that determined how different communities would react to foreign visitors. At several points during the journey, Ahmed would stop the truck and walk ahead to scout potential dangers or to meet with local contacts who could provide updated information about conditions ahead. The landscape they traveled through was both beautiful and terrifying. The Hindu Kush mountains rose majestically around them, but the valleys below were scarred by years of warfare. They passed destroyed villages, abandoned Soviet military posts, and fields that local farmers warned were heavily mined. The contrast between Afghanistan's natural beauty and the devastation of war made a profound impression on both journalists. As they traveled deeper into Afghanistan, they could hear distant explosions and gunfire echoing through the mountains. The war was still very active, despite the announced Soviet withdrawal timeline. They passed convoys of refugees heading toward Pakistan, families carrying whatever possessions they could manage, while fleeing areas where fighting was intensifying. Marcus filmed much of the journey, capturing the reality of a nation still consumed by conflict. His footage showed the human cost of the war: children who had never known peace, farmers afraid to work their fields because of mines, and communities that had been shattered by years of violence. They passed through several checkpoints where Mujahideen fighters examined their press credentials and equipment. Most encounters were brief and professional, but the tension was always present. The fighters were young, heavily armed, and understandably suspicious of strangers in their territory. Andrzej and his connections within the resistance movement were crucial for getting them through these dangerous encounters. At one checkpoint near the entrance to the Panjshir Valley, they met a group of fighters who provided disturbing news about conditions ahead. Soviet forces had launched a major offensive in the valley just 48 hours earlier, and the fighting was more intense than expected. Several other foreign journalists had turned back after receiving similar warnings earlier that week, but Marcus and James decided to continue, believing the story was too important to abandon. They had come too far and invested too much in this assignment to turn back because of increased danger. This decision would prove to be fatally misjudged, though neither man could have known it at the time. As they approached the final checkpoint before entering the valley proper, something occurred that would alter the course of their assignment completely and set in motion events that would lead to their disappearance. Final checkpoint Marcus Chen and James Morrison encountered was controlled by fighters loyal to Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary Mujahideen commander known as the Lion of Panjshir. These were seasoned warriors who had fought the Soviets for years in this valley, surviving multiple major offensives and developing sophisticated tactics for mountain warfare. Checkpoint was more elaborate than others they had encountered, with defensive positions built into the rocks and multiple layers of security. The fighters here were better equipped and more disciplined than the young men at earlier checkpoints. They carried modern weapons and communication equipment, evidence of the substantial foreign support flowing to Massoud's forces. The checkpoint commander, who introduced himself as Commander Halil, carefully examined both journalists' credentials and questioned them extensively about their intentions. Halil spoke excellent English, having been educated at Kabul University before the war began. He was suspicious, but not hostile, clearly trying to balance security concerns with the potential propaganda value of having Western journalists document their operations. Commander Halil warned them that Soviet forces were conducting major operations deeper in the valley as part of their final withdrawal strategy. The Soviets were trying to inflict maximum damage on Mujahideen positions before leaving, using massive artillery bombardments and airstrikes. Several villages had been completely destroyed in the past week, and civilian casualties were mounting. The commander explained that several other foreign journalists had turned back after receiving similar warnings earlier that week. The fighting was more intense than usual, and he couldn't guarantee the safety of civilians in the combat zone. His fighters were focused on military operations and couldn't spare resources to protect journalists who got into trouble, but Marcus and James decided to proceed, believing the story of Massoud's final battles against the Soviets was too historically important to abandon. Marcus argued that documenting these events was exactly why they had become war correspondents. If they only covered safe stories, they wouldn't be fulfilling their responsibility to show the world what was really happening in Afghanistan. Commander Halil reluctantly agreed to let them continue, but he assigned 2 of his fighters to escort them deeper into the valley. The escorts, he explained, would help them navigate the dangerous terrain and make contact with other Mujahideen units, but they couldn't provide protection if the journalists encountered Soviet forces. The Mujahideen fighters at this checkpoint would later provide crucial testimony about the 2 Americans. They remembered Marcus clearly, tall, methodical, carrying professional broadcast equipment that impressed the technically minded fighters. James was shorter, more talkative, with the easy manner of someone comfortable in dangerous situations. Both men appeared calm and prepared as they discussed their plans with Commander Halil. Ahmad Shah, their original guide, chose not to continue beyond this checkpoint. He explained that he had family obligations that prevented him from entering the active combat zone. This should have been a warning sign, but Marcus and James were so focused on their story that they didn't fully appreciate the significance of their experienced guides' reluctance to proceed. The 2 Mujahideen escorts assigned by Commander Halil were young fighters named Farid and Ibrahim. Both spoke some English and seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to show foreign journalists their operations against the Soviet forces. They promised to take Marcus and James to positions where they could safely film the ongoing battles. These fighters at the checkpoint would be the last people to see Marcus Chen and James Morrison alive under normal circumstances. Within 48 hours, both journalists would be missing, beginning a mystery that would consume their families and colleagues for decades. But the story of what happened to them would be far more complex than anyone imagined, involving not just the immediate dangers of warfare, but also broader political and military secrets that powerful forces were determined to keep hidden. After passing the final checkpoint, Marcus Chen and James Morrison continued deeper into the Panjshir Valley with their 2 Mujahideen escorts, Farid and Ibrahim. The landscape around them was breathtakingly beautiful, towering snow-capped peaks, clear mountain streams, and green valleys that seemed almost peaceful despite the distant sounds of warfare. But the signs of conflict were everywhere. They passed destroyed villages, abandoned Soviet equipment, and fresh bomb craters that marked their route deeper into the combat zone. The escorts pointed out various landmarks and explained the tactical significance of different positions in the ongoing battle. Their destination was a Mujahideen observation post about 20 kilometers from the checkpoint, where they could safely film Soviet positions and document the fighting without exposing themselves to direct fire. The post was located on a ridge that provided excellent views of the valley floor where much of the combat was taking place. The journey to the observation post took most of the day, as they had to move carefully through terrain that might be under surveillance by Soviet forces. They traveled on foot for much of the distance, leaving their vehicle hidden in a grove of trees where it couldn't be spotted by aircraft or long-range patrols. Marcus continued filming throughout the journey, capturing footage of the two young fighters who were guiding them, the spectacular mountain scenery, and the evidence of warfare that marked their path. His camera recorded conversations with Farid and Ibrahim, who explained their experiences fighting the Soviets and their hopes for Afghanistan's future once the occupation ended. The footage from this part of their journey would later prove crucial for investigators trying to understand what happened to Marcus and James. The video showed their precise route, the personalities of their escorts, and the overall security situation in the area where they would eventually disappear. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the sounds of fighting grew much closer. They could hear the distinctive noise of Soviet helicopter gunships, the crash of artillery rounds, and the chatter of automatic weapons echoing through the valleys. This was exactly the kind of active combat zone Marcus wanted to document, but it was also far more dangerous than anything he had previously experienced. Their escorts seemed confident and relaxed, chatting casually about the tactical situation and pointing out various Soviet positions that were visible in the distance. Farid and Ibrahim had been fighting in these mountains for several years and felt completely at home in the terrain. Their confidence was reassuring to Marcus and James, who were operating far outside their comfort zone. As evening approached, they reached the observation post where they planned to spend the night before beginning their documentation of the battle the next morning. The post was a well-concealed position built into the rocks, with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes in case of enemy attack. Other Mujahideen fighters were already at the post, preparing for night operations against Soviet positions. The fighters welcomed the foreign journalists and seemed genuinely pleased to have international attention focused on their struggle. They shared food and tea while explaining their battle plans and the larger strategic situation in the Panjshir Valley. Marcus and James felt optimistic about their assignment as they settled in for the night. They had reached their destination safely, established good relationships with their escorts and the other fighters, and positioned themselves to document what promised to be historically significant combat operations. None of them could have anticipated that they were about to become entangled in events that went far beyond the immediate military conflict they had come to cover. What would happen over the next 48 hours would not only cost Marcus and James their lives, but would also expose secrets that various parties had powerful reasons to keep hidden. The morning of September 17, 1989, began before dawn at the Mujahideen observation post. Marcus Chen and James Morrison woke to the sound of intense artillery fire echoing through the valley below. Soviet forces were conducting a major bombardment of suspected Mujahideen positions, part of their final push to inflict maximum damage before completing their withdrawal from Afghanistan. The bombardment provided exactly the kind of dramatic footage that Marcus needed for his CNN reports. He set up his camera equipment and began filming the explosions and the Mujahideen fighters' responses to the Soviet attacks. The video captured the intensity of the combat and the courage of the Afghan fighters who continued their operations despite being heavily outgunned. James Morrison moved around the position taking still photographs that would complement Marcus's video footage. His images captured individual fighters, their weapons and equipment, and the spectacular mountain setting that served as the backdrop for this final phase of the Soviet-Afghan war. Both journalists were in their element, working efficiently despite the dangerous conditions. They had found the perfect vantage point to document a historically significant battle, and their professional instincts told them they were capturing material that would have major impact when broadcast to international audiences. Their escorts, Farid and Ibrahim, served as translators and helped arrange interviews with other fighters at the post. The Mujahideen were eager to share their stories with Western journalists, seeing this as an opportunity to explain their cause to the outside world. The fighters talked about their families, their motivations for fighting, and their hopes for Afghanistan's future. Around mid-morning, the character of the battle began to change. Instead of the long-range artillery exchanges that had dominated the early hours, Soviet forces began moving closer to Mujahideen positions. Helicopter gunships appeared over the valley, conducting close support missions for advancing ground troops. The Mujahideen commander at the observation post, a veteran fighter named Abdul Rahman, became increasingly concerned about the tactical situation. The Soviet advance was more aggressive than expected, and there were reports that other Mujahideen positions had been overrun or under severe pressure. Commander Rahman made the decision to evacuate the observation post and fall back to more defensible positions deeper in the mountains. This was a standard tactical response to superior enemy forces, but it meant that Marcus and James would have to abandon their perfect filming location and move to less advantageous positions. The evacuation began around noon, with fighters quickly packing their equipment and preparing to move. Marcus and James gathered their cameras and recording devices, ready to follow their escorts to whatever new position the Mujahideen established. As they prepared to leave the observation post, something unexpected happened that would change the entire course of their assignment and ultimately lead to their deaths. As the Mujahideen fighters prepared to evacuate their observation post, a radio message arrived that dramatically changed the tactical situation. Commander Rahman received reports that Soviet forces had been spotted moving through a valley that was supposed to be under secure Mujahideen control. This meant that the standard escape routes were potentially compromised. More disturbing was intelligence suggesting that the Soviet advance was not just a military operation, but included elements that were conducting what appeared to be intelligence-gathering activities. Local villagers reported seeing Soviet troops accompanied by men in civilian clothes who were photographing documents and questioning captured fighters extensively. Commander Rahman realized that the situation was far more complex and dangerous than a simple military engagement. If Soviet intelligence units were operating in the area, they would be particularly interested in capturing foreign journalists who might have valuable information about Mujahideen operations and international support networks. The commander faced a difficult decision. He could try to evacuate Marcus and James through potentially compromised routes, risking their capture by Soviet forces. Alternatively, he could hide them at a secure location until the tactical situation stabilized. Neither option was without serious risks. Marcus and James, focused on their journalistic mission, didn't initially understand the full implications of the changed situation. They were eager to continue filming and saw the evolving battle as an opportunity to capture even more dramatic footage. Their professional instincts were overwhelming their survival instincts. Farid and Ibrahim, their young escorts, were equally focused on the military situation and the excitement of being involved in what appeared to be a major engagement with Soviet forces. Like Marcus and James, they didn't fully appreciate the broader dangers that Commander Rahman had identified. The decision made in those crucial moments would determine the fate of everyone at the observation post. Commander Rahman chose to split his forces, sending some fighters to establish new defensive positions while keeping others behind to escort the journalists to what he believed would be a safer location. This decision, made with the best of intentions and based on incomplete intelligence, would prove to be catastrophic. The safer location that Commander Rahman had chosen was actually moving them directly into the path of the very forces they were trying to avoid. The group, consisting of Marcus, James, Farid, Ibrahim, and 4 other Mujahideen fighters, began moving through mountain terrain toward what they believed would be a secure position. They traveled carefully, using cover and concealment techniques that the fighters had perfected during years of warfare against Soviet forces. Marcus continued filming during the movement, capturing footage that would later prove invaluable for investigators trying to understand exactly what happened during his final assignment. The video showed the route they took, the tactical procedures the Mujahideen used, and the deteriorating security situation they were moving through. But they were walking into a trap that none of them could have anticipated or avoided. The group led by Farid and Ibrahim moved through increasingly dangerous terrain as they sought to reach the secure position that Commander Rahman had designated. The landscape was spectacular, but treacherous. Narrow paths along steep mountainsides, dense forests that provided cover, but also concealment for potential enemies, and rocky areas where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall. Marcus Chen continued documenting their journey, though he was now filming more discreetly to avoid giving away their position to potential observers. His footage showed the growing tension among their Mujahideen escorts, who were beginning to realize that the tactical situation was deteriorating more rapidly than they had expected. James Morrison walked slightly ahead of Marcus, taking still photographs and serving as an additional set of eyes to spot potential dangers. Both journalists were experienced enough to recognize that their situation was becoming increasingly precarious, but they trusted their escort's knowledge of the terrain and local conditions. First sign that something was seriously wrong came around 2 p.m. when they heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from multiple directions. Soviet helicopter gunships were conducting a coordinated search pattern, systematically covering the mountain valleys where Mujahideen forces were known to operate. Farid immediately ordered everyone to take cover in a grove of trees while the helicopters passed overhead. The aircraft flew several search patterns, using techniques that suggested they were looking for specific targets rather than conducting routine reconnaissance. The helicopters were equipped with advanced surveillance equipment that could detect heat signatures and movement even through forest cover. After the helicopters moved on, the group continued their movement, but everyone now understood that they were operating in an area where Soviet forces were conducting intensive search operations. The Mujahideen fighters began moving more cautiously, using enhanced security procedures that significantly slowed their progress. Around 4 p.m., they encountered their first direct evidence that the area was not as secure as they had believed. They discovered fresh tracks and equipment indicating that a large military unit had recently passed through the area. The tracks appeared to be from Soviet vehicles, but there were also footprints from what appeared to be a much larger force than typically operated in these mountains. Ibrahim, who had the most experience reading military signs, examined the tracks carefully and delivered disturbing news. The force that had passed through included not just regular Soviet troops, but also what appeared to be special forces units and possibly intelligence personnel. This was the kind of mixed military and intelligence operation that posed the greatest danger to foreign journalists. The group was now faced with a critical decision. They could continue toward their original destination, knowing that it might already be compromised by Soviet forces. They could try to return to their starting point, but that would mean crossing terrain where they had already observed intensive search operations. Or they could try to find an alternative safe location, though none of their escorts knew the area well enough to guarantee security. Marcus and James, as civilians with no military training, had to rely completely on the judgment of their Mujahideen escorts. The young fighters were brave and experienced, but they were also operating in a tactical situation that was far more complex than anything they had previously encountered. The decision made in those moments would determine whether the journalists lived or died, but none of them had enough information to make a truly informed choice about their next move. As evening approached on September 17th, the group found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. They had been moving through dangerous terrain for hours without reaching the secure position that Commander Rahman had designated. Worse, they were now receiving radio reports indicating that Soviet forces had overrun several Mujahideen positions and were conducting aggressive sweep operations throughout the region. Farid and Ibrahim were clearly worried. though they tried to maintain confidence in front of the foreign journalists. Their radio communications with other Mujahideen units were becoming sporadic, suggesting that their command and control networks were being disrupted by the Soviet operations. Marcus continued filming intermittently, now focusing on documenting the tactical situation and the growing concern among their escorts. His footage captured conversations between the unearthed fighters as they tried to establish contact with their commanders and determine the best course of action. As darkness fell, the group made the decision to stop for the night in a concealed position among large rocks that provided both shelter and defensive advantages. They couldn't risk moving through unfamiliar terrain in darkness, especially with enemy forces operating in the area. The night was tense and largely sleepless. Soviet aircraft continued flying search patterns overhead, using flares and searchlights to illuminate suspected hiding places. The sound of ground vehicles could be heard in the distance, suggesting that sweep operations were continuing around the clock. Marcus and James took turns sleeping and keeping watch, though neither man had any military training that would help them identify approaching threats. They relied completely on their Mujahideen escorts, who demonstrated impressive discipline and professionalism despite their youth and the extreme danger of their situation. Around 3 a.m., their situation became even more precarious when they observed what appeared to be a large military convoy moving through a valley below their position. The convoy included not just Soviet military vehicles, but also trucks carrying what looked like specialized equipment and personnel who were clearly not regular combat troops. Ibrahim whispered to Marcus that the convoy appeared to include KGB personnel and possibly other intelligence operatives who were conducting special operations in conjunction with the military withdrawal. This was exactly the kind of sensitive activity that would make foreign journalists extremely valuable targets for capture or elimination. Dawn on September 18th brought no improvement in their tactical situation. Radio communications revealed that multiple Mujahideen positions had been overrun during the night, and Commander Rahman's forces were in full retreat toward the Pakistani border. The secure position they had been trying to reach was now certainly in enemy hands. The group faced a stark choice: attempt a dangerous daylight movement toward the Pakistani border, or remain hidden and hope that Soviet forces would move on without discovering their position. Either choice involved enormous risks, and their Mujahideen escorts were clearly divided about the best course of action. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that their situation took a turn that none of them could have anticipated. The decision they made would not only determine their immediate survival, but would also lead them into the mystery that would remain unsolved for 35 years. On the morning of September 18, 1989, Marcus Chen, James Morrison, and their 4 Mujahideen escorts made a fateful decision that would determine their ultimate fate. Faced with the choice between attempting a dangerous retreat toward Pakistan or remaining hidden in their current position, they chose what seemed like a third option that promised greater safety. Farid had remembered a network of caves in a nearby mountainside that the Mujahideen had used as weapon storage and safe houses during previous operations. These caves were well concealed and had multiple entrances, making them ideal hiding places until the Soviet sweep operations moved through the area. The group began moving toward the caves around 9 a.m., traveling through terrain that required extreme caution. They moved in single file, with Ibrahim leading and Farid bringing up the rear. Marcus and James stayed in the middle of the formation, carrying their equipment and trying to avoid making noise that might attract attention. Journey to the caves took nearly 3 hours through some of the most treacherous terrain any of them had encountered. They had to cross exposed ridgelines where they were vulnerable to observation from aircraft, navigate through dense forest where visibility was severely limited, and climb rocky slopes where a single loose stone could alert enemy forces to their presence. Marcus continued documenting their movement, though he was now filming only when they were in secure positions. His camera captured the increasing desperation of their situation and the growing exhaustion that was affecting everyone in the group. The footage showed fighters who were clearly operating at the limits of their endurance and beyond their normal tactical comfort zone. Around noon, they finally reached the cave complex that Farid had remembered. The caves were indeed well concealed, hidden behind rock formations and vegetation that made them nearly impossible to spot from a distance. The entrances were narrow, but opened into larger chambers that could accommodate their entire group. But as they approached the caves, they made a discovery that changed everything about their situation. The caves were not empty, as Farid had expected. Instead, they found evidence that other people had been using the complex recently, and those people were not Mujahideen. Fighters. The discovery inside the caves would expose Marcus and James to secrets that powerful forces were determined to keep hidden, ultimately sealing their fate and creating a mystery that would remain unsolved for 35 years. Inside the cave complex, the group found clear evidence that Soviet special forces had been using the location as a temporary base of operations. There were maps, communication equipment, and documents written in Russian that suggested this was far more than a simple military outpost. The materials indicated that intelligence gathering operations were being conducted from this location. More disturbing was the discovery of equipment and documents that appeared to belong to other foreign nationals, possibly journalists or aid workers, who had been captured by Soviet forces. Marcus and James found cameras, notebooks, and personal items that clearly did not belong to military personnel. Ibrahim, who could read some Russian due to his education before the war, examined the documents and provided a translation that horrified everyone present. The papers described systematic operations to capture or eliminate foreign witnesses to certain military activities that were not supposed to be officially acknowledged. Marcus immediately began filming the evidence they had discovered, understanding that this material could provide crucial proof of activities that violated international law. His camera recorded the documents, maps, and equipment in detail, creating a comprehensive record of what appeared to be war crimes. But their discovery of this sensitive material also meant that they were now in possession of information that various parties would kill to protect. As they examined the evidence, they could hear the sound of vehicles approaching the area around the caves. Their hiding place was about to be compromised. The group quickly gathered the most important documents and prepared to evacuate the caves through a back entrance that Farid had located. But as they moved toward the exit, they heard voices speaking Russian just outside the cave complex. Soviet forces had arrived at the location, apparently conducting a scheduled check of their temporary base. Marcus and James found themselves trapped in a situation that went far beyond anything they had expected when they started their assignment. They were not just war correspondents who had gotten too close to combat. They were now witnesses to activities that could cause international incidents if publicly revealed. The young Mujahideen fighters were equally unprepared for this level of complexity and danger. They had volunteered to escort foreign journalists to document conventional military operations, not to become involved in intelligence operations that could have far-reaching political consequences. As Soviet voices grew closer to their hiding place, everyone in the group realized that their situation had become desperate. They were trapped underground with evidence of activities that powerful people would do anything to keep secret. Discovery would mean not just capture, but almost certain execution. To prevent them from revealing what they had learned, the next few hours would determine not only whether Marcus and James survived, but also whether the evidence they had discovered would ever reach the outside world. Their situation had evolved from a dangerous but routine war reporting assignment into something that would have consequences lasting decades. The group remained hidden in the back chambers of the cave complex for over 4 hours while Soviet forces conducted what appeared to be a thorough inspection of their temporary base. Marcus and James could hear Russian voices echoing through the cave system, along with the sounds of equipment being moved and vehicles arriving and departing. During this terrifying period, Marcus continued filming whenever it was safe to do so. His camera captured the faces of the frightened Mujahideen fighters, the evidence they had discovered, and whispered conversations about their increasingly desperate situation. This footage would later prove crucial for investigators, trying to understand what happened during the journalist's final days. Ibrahim used his knowledge of Russian to eavesdrop on the Soviet forces' conversations. What he overheard was even more disturbing than what they had read in the documents. The Soviet forces were not just conducting routine military operations, they were systematically eliminating witnesses to activities that their government wanted to keep secret. The conversation Ibrahim translated revealed that several other foreign journalists and aid workers had been captured in recent weeks and had been secretly executed after being interrogated about their knowledge of Soviet operations. This was not random violence of war, but a systematic policy to prevent certain information from reaching international audiences. Marcus and James realized that they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than conventional warfare. They were now witnesses to evidence of war crimes and systematic murder of civilians, information that could trigger international investigations and diplomatic crises. Their value as potential witnesses made them extremely dangerous to keep alive. As evening approached, the Soviet forces finally departed from the cave complex, apparently satisfied that their temporary base remained secure. But their departure did not mean safety for the hidden group. It only provided a temporary respite to plan their next move. The group now faced an impossible situation. They could not return to Mujahideen positions without exposing other fighters to retaliation for the evidence they carried. They could not reach Pakistani territory without crossing areas that were now under intensive surveillance by Soviet forces looking for exactly the kind of witnesses they had become. Their only realistic option was to try to hide in the mountains until the Soviet withdrawal was complete, then attempt to reach safety with the evidence they had discovered. But surviving in the mountains for weeks or months would be extremely difficult, especially while avoiding the systematic search operations that were now being conducted. The decision they made that evening would determine their ultimate fate and create the mystery that would remain unsolved for 35 years. Marcus's camera would capture their final days, but that footage would remain buried with them until technology and changing political circumstances finally allowed the truth to emerge. The group decided to abandon the cave complex under cover of darkness and search for a more secure long-term hiding place deeper in the mountains. They gathered the most important evidence documents, destroyed anything that might indicate their presence in the caves, and prepared for what they knew would be an extremely dangerous journey. Marcus and James were now fully committed to their role as protectors of evidence that could expose systematic war crimes. They understood that their journalistic responsibility had evolved into something much more significant. They were potentially the only witnesses to activities that violated international law and human rights. The Mujahideen fighters, despite their youth and limited experience with such complex situations, demonstrated remarkable loyalty and courage. They could have abandoned the foreign journalists and returned to their own units, but instead they chose to share the dangers of protecting evidence that could help hold war criminals accountable. As they left the cave complex and began moving through the mountain terrain, none of them could have anticipated that they were beginning a journey that would end with their deaths, but would also preserve crucial evidence that would eventually help solve dozens of other mysterious disappearances and expose the truth about systematic atrocities committed during the final phase of the Soviet-Afghan War. Over the following days, Marcus Chen and James Morrison, along with their 4 Mujahideen escorts, moved through increasingly remote mountain terrain while trying to avoid the systematic search operations being conducted by Soviet forces. They were carrying evidence that could expose war crimes, making them extremely valuable targets for capture or elimination. The group's situation deteriorated rapidly as they struggled to find food, clean water, and shelter in the harsh mountain environment. They were operating far from any friendly forces and could not risk making contact with other Mujahideen units for fear of exposing them to retaliation. Marcus continued filming their ordeal, creating a record of their desperate attempts to survive while protecting the evidence they had discovered. His footage showed the physical and psychological toll of their situation. Fighters and journalists alike were being pushed beyond their limits of endurance. On September 22nd, their situation became critical when James Morrison became seriously ill with what appeared to be a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and possibly dysentery. He could no longer keep up with the group's movement and required rest and medical attention that they couldn't provide in their current circumstances. Group was forced to find a more permanent hiding place where James could recover, but this meant remaining stationary in an area where Soviet search operations were intensifying. They located a small cave system that provided shelter, but offered limited options for escape if they were discovered. For 3 days, they remained in the cave while James's condition worsened and Soviet forces conducted increasingly aggressive search operations in the surrounding area. Marcus filmed James's deteriorating condition and then group's growing desperation as their supplies ran out and their situation became hopeless. It was during this period that Marcus made the decision to hide the most sensitive evidence and his final footage in a location where it might eventually be recovered, even if none of them survived their ordeal. He wrapped the materials in waterproof containers and buried them near distinctive rock formations that could be identified by future search teams. On September 25th, their hiding place was finally discovered by Soviet forces, conducting a systematic search of the cave systems in the area. The group's ordeal was about to end, but the mystery of their disappearance was just beginning. The discovery of Marcus Chen, James Morrison, and their Mujahideen escorts by Soviet forces marked the end of their week-long ordeal, but the beginning of events that would create the 35-year mystery surrounding their disappearance. The group was captured without resistance. They were too weak and exhausted to attempt any escape or fight. Marcus had managed to hide his camera and the most sensitive documents before their capture, but Soviet forces found other equipment that identified them as foreign journalists who had been operating in the area. This discovery triggered immediate concerns among Soviet commanders about what the journalists might have seen or documented. Captured group was transported to a temporary detention facility that Soviet forces had established in a remote valley. This facility was not an official prison, but rather an improvised site where sensitive prisoners could be held and interrogated without creating official records of their capture or detention. Marcus and James were separated from their Mujahideen escorts and subjected to intensive interrogation about their activities, their knowledge of Soviet operations, and what they had documented during their time in Afghanistan. The interrogators were particularly concerned about any evidence the journalists might have gathered about activities that were not supposed to be officially acknowledged. Both journalists maintained their cover as neutral war correspondents, but their interrogators were skeptical and increasingly aggressive. The Soviet forces had found enough evidence of their presence at sensitive locations to conclude that they had witnessed activities that could not be allowed to become public knowledge. After several days of interrogation, Soviet commanders made the decision that Marcus and James knew too much to be safely released or exchanged. They had seen evidence of systematic execution of foreign witnesses and had potentially documented war crimes that could trigger international investigations. The decision was made to eliminate both journalists and their escorts to prevent any possibility of their testimony reaching the outside world. This decision was not made locally, but came from higher authorities, who understood the potential political consequences of allowing the journalists' knowledge to become public. On October 1st, 1989, Marcus Chen and James Morrison were executed along with their 4 Mujahideen escorts. Their bodies were buried in a remote location along with most of their equipment, creating the impression that they had simply disappeared during the chaos of the ongoing conflict. However, Soviet forces failed to locate the camera and documents that Marcus had hidden before their capture. This evidence would remain buried in the Afghan mountains for 35 years, waiting for changing political circumstances and advancing technology to finally reveal the truth about what happened to the missing journalists. The executions were carried out in secret and never officially acknowledged by Soviet authorities. The search for the missing journalists continued for months, but investigators were searching in the wrong areas and had no way of knowing that the men they sought were already dead. The mystery of Marcus Chen and James Morrison's disappearance became one of the most enduring unsolved cases from the Soviet-Afghan War, generating theories and investigations that would continue for decades. But the truth remained buried with their equipment in the mountains where they had tried to hide evidence of the atrocities they had witnessed. In the immediate aftermath of Marcus Chen and James Morrison's disappearance, extensive search operations were launched by multiple organizations. CNN mobilized significant resources to find their missing correspondent, while international journalists' organizations demanded that all parties in the conflict assist in locating the 2 Americans. The searches were hampered by several factors that investigators could not have anticipated. Soviet forces, who knew exactly what had happened to the journalists, provided misleading information about their possible whereabouts while appearing to cooperate with search efforts. Mujahideen groups had no knowledge of the journalists' fate and could only provide information about their last known positions. Most critically, searchers were looking in areas where they expected to find living journalists in hiding or prisoners being held by various factions. None of the search teams considered the possibility that Marcus and James had been systematically executed as part of a cover-up operation, so they never searched the remote burial sites where the bodies had been hidden. The case generated significant media attention, particularly because of Marcus's famous father and the dramatic circumstances of the disappearance. David Shun traveled to Pakistan multiple times, meeting with government officials and Mujahideen commanders in desperate attempts to find information about his son's fate. International pressure mounted for more aggressive search efforts, but the deteriorating security situation in Afghanistan made comprehensive investigations increasingly difficult. As Soviet withdrawal continued and various Afghan factions began fighting each other, large areas of the country became inaccessible to foreign search teams. By early 1990, official search efforts were scaled back, though families and news organizations continued following leads and investigating rumors about the missing journalists. The case transitioned from an active search and rescue operation to a missing persons investigation that would continue for decades. During this period, various theories emerged about what might have happened to Marcus and James. Some suggested they had been killed in combat. Others proposed they had been captured by different factions, and a few speculated that they might still be alive in remote prisons. None of these theories came close to the truth about their systematic execution and secret burial. The failure to solve the case quickly meant that crucial evidence deteriorated and witnesses dispersed. Many of the Mujahideen fighters who might have provided useful information were killed in subsequent fighting, while Soviet personnel returned to the USSR and became inaccessible to Western investigators. As the months turned into years, the Marcus Chen case joined the growing list of journalists who had disappeared during conflicts around the world. Without bodies or definitive evidence of death, Families maintained hope while investigators gradually moved on to more recent cases. The buried camera and documents that might have solved the mystery remained hidden in the mountains, protected by the same remote location that had failed to protect the journalists themselves. The evidence waited in the ground while the world above changed dramatically with the end of the Cold War and the transformation of the Soviet Union. As the 1990s progressed, the search for Marcus Chen and James Morrison became increasingly difficult due to Afghanistan's descent into civil war. The Soviet withdrawal had been completed by February 1990, but the country immediately fell into conflict between various Mujahideen factions who had united against the occupation but now fought each other for control. The security situation made investigation virtually impossible. Areas where Marcus and James might have traveled became battlegrounds between competing warlords. Many of the Mujahideen commanders who might have had information about the missing journalists were killed in the factional fighting. Taking their knowledge to their graves, international attention shifted away from individual missing persons cases toward the broader humanitarian crisis created by Afghanistan's civil war. With millions of refugees and ongoing combat throughout the country, resources that might have been devoted to finding missing journalists were redirected to more pressing humanitarian needs. David Chun continued his private efforts to find information about his son, hiring investigators and maintaining contacts with anyone who might provide leads. But the investigators faced enormous challenges. They could not safely travel to most areas of Afghanistan. Many potential witnesses had been displaced or killed, and official records from the Soviet period were inaccessible. The case was further complicated by the rise of the Taliban movement in the mid-1990s. The Taliban's strict interpretation of Islamic law made them hostile to Western journalists and investigators. When they gained control of most of Afghanistan in 1996, they effectively banned foreign media and refused to cooperate with investigations into missing persons from previous conflicts. During the Taliban period, Afghanistan became almost completely isolated from the international community. Even organizations that specialized in finding missing persons could not operate in the country. The case of Marcus Chen and James Morrison, along with dozens of other disappearances from the Soviet period, entered a kind of frozen state where no new information could be gathered. Family members and colleagues of the missing journalists maintained hope, but they had no practical way to conduct searches or follow up on potential leads. The evidence that could have solved their cases remained buried in mountains that had become inaccessible to the outside world. This period of isolation lasted until September 11, 2001, when international attention returned to Afghanistan with dramatic consequences. The subsequent American invasion and occupation would eventually create new opportunities to investigate old mysteries, but it would take years before resources could be devoted to cases like Marcus Chen's disappearance. The investigation into Marcus Chen and James Morrison's disappearance entered a new phase after the September 11, 2001 attacks and the subsequent U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan. The overthrow of the Taliban government and establishment of international forces in Afghanistan created new opportunities for organizations investigating missing persons from previous conflicts. By 2003, the International Committee of the Red Cross began systematic efforts to document and investigate disappearances from various periods of Afghanistan's conflicts. They established programs to interview refugees, former fighters, and civilians about foreign nationals who had gone missing during the Soviet occupation, civil war, and Taliban periods. The investigators faced enormous challenges. Decades had passed since most disappearances occurred. Witnesses had died or been displaced, and much of Afghanistan remained dangerous for international investigators. However, they gradually began collecting testimony from people who had been reluctant or unable to speak about their experiences during previous periods. One of their most significant breakthroughs came in 2005 when they interviewed an elderly former Mujahideen commander who had operated in the Panjshir Valley during the final phase of the Soviet occupation. The commander, who was dying of cancer and wanted to clear his conscience, provided information about foreign journalists who had disappeared in his area of operations. According to this source, several Western journalists had been captured by Soviet forces during the 1989 withdrawal period and had been systematically executed to prevent them from revealing evidence of war crimes. The commander claimed to have witnessed some of these executions and could provide approximate locations where the victims had been buried. This testimony was the first credible account that suggested Marcus and James had not simply died in combat or been killed by random violence, but had been targeted for elimination because of what they had witnessed. The commander's account also suggested that their case was part of a much larger pattern of systematic murder of foreign witnesses. Based on this testimony, international investigators began planning the first serious search operation for Marcus Chen and James Morrison since the immediate aftermath of their disappearance. However, organizing such an operation would require extensive resources, high-level political support, and careful coordination with Afghan authorities and coalition forces. The planning phase took nearly 2 years, during which investigators gathered additional testimony from other sources and used satellite imagery to identify potential search areas. They also had to develop security protocols that would allow search teams to operate safely in areas that remained contested by various armed groups. By 2007, the investigation had evolved from a missing persons case into a broader effort to document systematic atrocities committed during the final phase of the Soviet-Afghan War. Marcus and James had become symbols of dozens of foreign nationals who had disappeared under similar circumstances, and finding their remains could help solve multiple cases simultaneously. In 2008, the first formal search expedition for Marcus Chen and James Morrison was launched under the auspices of the International Committee of the Red Cross, with support from CNN, the U.S. State Department, and the Afghan government. The team included forensic specialists, military personnel for security, and experts in recovering remains from conflict zones. The search focused on areas in the Panjshir Valley where the dying Mujahideen commander had indicated that executions had taken place. The team used ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and other advanced technology to search for burial sites that might contain human remains and equipment belonging to missing journalists. The operation faced enormous challenges. The terrain was extremely difficult, with steep mountain slopes and rocky ground that made excavation dangerous and slow. Weather conditions were harsh, and the team had to work quickly during brief windows when security conditions allowed access to remote areas. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, the team had found various pieces of military equipment and debris from the Soviet period, but nothing that could definitively be linked to Marcus Chen or James Morrison. The search area was vast, and the landmarks mentioned by their source had changed significantly over 2 decades. Just as the expedition was preparing to conclude without success, one of their metal detectors identified a strong signal in a remote valley, about 15 kilometers from where they had been concentrating their efforts. The signal indicated buried metal objects of the type that might be associated with broadcast equipment. The team began careful excavation of the site, using forensic techniques to preserve any evidence they might discover. About 3 feet underground, they found the first piece of equipment that would eventually solve the 19-year-old mystery of what happened to Marcus Chen and James Morrison. The first item, recovered from the burial site, was a professional BROADCAST camera of the type used by television correspondents in the late 1980s. The camera was badly corroded after nearly 2 decades underground, but manufacturer markings and serial numbers were still visible. A check of CNN's equipment records confirmed that this camera had been assigned to Marcus Chen for his Afghanistan assignment. The discovery immediately energized the search team and attracted high-level attention from government officials and news organizations around the world. After 19 years of searching, they had found the first concrete physical evidence of what had happened to the missing journalists. Careful excavation around the camera location revealed additional equipment, including recording devices, batteries, and other broadcasting gear that matched the inventory of equipment Marcus had taken with him on his final assignment. More significantly, they began finding personal items, including identification documents and clothing, fragments that could be linked to both Marcus and James Morrison. The most important discovery came when searchers found human remains at the burial site. The remains were in poor condition after 2 decades underground in Afghanistan's harsh mountain climate, but forensic specialists were able to confirm that they belonged to multiple individuals, consistent with accounts that several people had been buried at the location. Along with the human remains, the team discovered additional evidence that supported the testimony about systematic executions. They found spent ammunition casings, restraints, and other materials that suggested the deaths had not occurred during combat, but had been deliberate executions. However, the most significant discovery was still buried deeper in the site. Marcus's camera had been protected by a waterproof case that had preserved not only the equipment, but also videotapes that might still contain footage from his final assignment. The videotapes were carefully extracted and transported to a specialized laboratory in Germany that had experience recovering audio and video from severely damaged media. The preservation of the tapes after 19 years underground was considered remarkable, and there was genuine hope that they might contain footage that would finally explain what had happened to Marcus and James. The recovery process for the videotapes would take months, but preliminary examination suggested that at least some of the footage might be recoverable. If successful, the tapes could provide not only evidence about the journalists' final days, but also documentation of the activities they had been killed to prevent from becoming public. The discovery at the burial site had solved the mystery of Marcus Chen and James Morrison's disappearance, but it had also raised new questions about the systematic execution of foreign witnesses during the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The evidence suggested that their case was part of a much larger cover-up operation that had claimed dozens of lives. The specialized laboratory in Cologne, Germany, began the delicate process of recovering footage from Marcus Chen's buried videotapes using techniques developed for restoring damaged historical recordings. The tapes had been underground for 19 years in conditions that would normally destroy magnetic media, but the waterproof case had provided enough protection to leave portions of the recordings intact. The restoration process required months of careful work using modified chemical processes and specialized equipment. Laboratory technicians had to develop new techniques specifically for dealing with tapes that had been exposed to soil, chemistry, and mountain climate conditions for extended periods. After 6 months of intensive work, the laboratory achieved their first breakthrough. Several segments of Marcus's final footage were successfully recovered, though the video quality was poor and many sections remained unrecoverable. The footage clearly showed scenes from Marcus's final assignment in Afghanistan in September 1989. The recovered video included images of the Mujahideen checkpoint encounters, mountain landscapes, and fighters that Marcus had filmed during his journey into the Panjshir Valley. The footage confirmed the timeline and locations that investigators had reconstructed based on witness testimony and other evidence. But the most significant material was footage that Marcus had apparently recorded in secret after his capture by Soviet forces. The video showed their detention facility, their interrogators, and conversations between prisoners that revealed the true scope of the systematic execution program that had claimed their lives. Marcus had somehow managed to keep filming even during his captivity, creating a record of war crimes that Soviet authorities had thought they had successfully buried. His camera had continued recording right up until his execution, capturing evidence that would finally hold his killers accountable nearly 2 decades after the crimes were committed. The recovered footage provided definitive proof that Marcus and James had been systematically murdered for what they had witnessed, rather than killed in combat or by random violence. The video evidence would become crucial for war crimes investigations and would help solve dozens of other disappearance cases from the same period. Most importantly for the families involved, the footage provided closure that they had sought for nearly 2 decades. Marcus's father, David Chen, would finally learn exactly what had happened to his son and would have evidence that Marcus had died trying to document important truths about systematic atrocities committed during the Soviet withdrawal. The footage also revealed the location where Marcus had hidden additional evidence before his capture. This material would lead to even more discoveries about the systematic murder of foreign witnesses during the final phase of the Soviet-Afghan War. Among the most disturbing footage recovered from Marcus Chen's camera were secret recordings he had made of conversations with other prisoners at the Soviet detention facility. The video showed that the facility held not just Marcus and James, but also several other foreign nationals who had been captured for witnessing sensitive activities. The recordings revealed that Soviet forces had been systematically capturing and executing foreign journalists, aid workers, and other witnesses to activities that were not supposed to be officially acknowledged. The program was designed to prevent any evidence of war crimes from reaching international audiences during the final phase of the Soviet withdrawal. Marcus's footage showed conversations with a French photographer who had been held at the facility for several weeks, a British aid worker who had witnessed mass executions of civilians, and 2 other American journalists who had been captured while documenting Soviet military operations. All of these individuals would eventually be executed to prevent their testimony from becoming public. The prisoners had shared information about their experiences and the activities they had witnessed, creating a comprehensive record of systematic atrocities that Soviet authorities were desperate to keep secret. Marcus had managed to record many of these conversations, preserving testimony from witnesses who would otherwise have disappeared without a trace. The footage also showed the prisoners' awareness that they were likely to be executed and their attempts to preserve evidence that might eventually reach the outside world. Several prisoners had written detailed accounts of what they had witnessed, and Marcus had filmed these documents before they were discovered and destroyed by their captors. Most significantly, the footage revealed the location of a cache where Marcus and other prisoners had hidden additional evidence before their execution. This information would lead to another search operation that would uncover even more extensive documentation of systematic war crimes committed during the Soviet withdrawal. The hidden cache mentioned in Marcus's footage was located using coordinates he had secretly recorded in his final videos. A second search expedition in 2009 discovered buried documents, photographs, and other evidence that had been hidden by multiple prisoners at the Soviet detention facility. This evidence provided proof of systematic murder of foreign witnesses, mass executions of Afghan civilians, and other war crimes that had never been officially acknowledged. The material would be used in international war crimes tribunals and would help families of dozens of missing persons finally learn what had happened to their loved ones. Marcus Chen's determination to continue documenting truth even while facing certain death had preserved evidence that would eventually bring justice for numerous victims of war crimes. His buried camera had not only solved his own disappearance, but had also exposed a systematic cover-up operation that had remained hidden for 2 decades. The discovery of Marcus Chen's footage and the additional evidence cache led to the establishment of formal war crimes investigations by international tribunals. The evidence provided proof of systematic murder of civilians and foreign nationals during the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, activities that had never been officially acknowledged by Russian authorities. The investigations revealed that the execution program had been authorized at high levels of Soviet military and intelligence leadership as part of a strategy to prevent evidence of controversial military operations from reaching international audiences. The program had resulted in the deaths of at least 47 foreign nationals and hundreds of Afghan civilians who had witnessed sensitive activities. Several former Soviet officials were eventually charged with war crimes based on evidence that Marcus and other victims had preserved. While most of the individuals responsible had died or could not be extradited for trial, the investigations provided official recognition of the systematic nature of the atrocities and helped families obtain closure. The Marcus Chen case also led to significant changes in international protocols for protecting journalists and other civilians in conflict zones. His footage demonstrated the vulnerability of war correspondents and the need for better security measures and communication systems that might have prevented his capture. CNN and other news organizations implemented new safety requirements for correspondents working in dangerous areas, including emergency beacons, encrypted communications, and detailed tracking systems that would make it much harder for journalists to simply disappear without a trace. The Marcus Chen Foundation, established by his family, continues to support journalist safety initiatives and investigation of missing persons from conflict zones. The foundation funds research into protective technology and provides equipment and training that help keep war correspondents safer. Marcus's story serves as a reminder that some of the most important journalism involves exposing truths that powerful people want to keep hidden. His commitment to documenting evidence of systematic atrocities, even when he knew it would cost his life, created a legacy that continues to protect other journalists and help bring justice for victims of war crimes. The buried camera that preserved his final footage became more than just evidence of one tragedy. It became a tool for exposing systematic injustice and holding war criminals accountable. What started as one family's desperate search became a catalyst for international investigations that helped solve dozens of missing persons cases and brought recognition to hundreds of previously unknown victims. Sometimes the most impactful stories take decades to fully develop, but truth, like Marcus's buried camera, has a way of eventually coming to light. Marcus Chen's disappearance reminds us that even when someone vanishes without a trace, their commitment to truth-telling can still change the world years later. His camera, buried in the Afghan mountains for 19 years, became more than just evidence of one tragedy. It became a foundation for justice, a tool for exposing systematic atrocities, and a reminder that the courage to document truth can have impact that lasts far beyond a single lifetime. What started as one journalist's final assignment became the key to understanding one of the most systematic cover-up operations of the late Cold War period, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, the truth will eventually emerge.